Welcome back to the deep dive. We're starting something new today, a multi-part exploration.
That's right. We're really going deep into a specific and pretty complex historical narrative.
Exactly.
Quite
We'll
that.
be meticulously unpacking the anti-colonial political and military struggle, focusing, particularly on Eritrea and Ethiopia.
And specifically how one particular source sees the whole transition between regimes there and like the fundamental nature of the power structures involved.
And this is absolutely key. Right from the start, everything we talk about in this deep dive comes entirely from one source, Shabate.
Yeah, that's crucial. We're not bringing in other viewpoints, no outside info. Our job here is just to understand the source's perspective.
What are its arguments? What evidence does it put forward? That's the mission.
Think of it like we're reading the source material together, really digging into its narrative.
Exactly. A guided tour through Shabate's perspective. And it's not a quick one. This is part one of a four-part series.
4 parts. So we'll be systematically working through the points Shabate makes.
Today is really about setting the foundation, understanding the historical backdrop as this source presents it.
So looking at how Shabate characterizes the Haile Selassie regime first.
Yep. And then moving into its initial analysis of the Dergue, how they emerged, their early policies, how they dealt with opposition, according to Shabate.
We're basically laying the groundwork for everything else Shabate talks about in the later parts.
Okay, so where does Shabate begin? What's the opening frame?
Well, Shabate doesn't waste any time. It immediately frames the national struggle of the Eritrean people as fundamentally a fight against what it terms Ethiopian colonial regimes.
Okay, colonial regime. So yeah, right away, that's a strong label from the source.
Very strong. And according to Shabate, these regimes were driven by persistent empire-building ambitions. That's a core theme.
Empire building. And were they acting alone in this view?
No, Shabate makes a point of saying they were supported by world colonialist forces.
Ah, so it's placing this struggle right from the outset in a bigger global context. Colonialism, external support.
Precisely. And the source argues that this struggle continued because those imperial dreams and the interests backing them didn't just disappear.
So changing the leader wasn't enough, according to Shabate. The underlying issue persisted.
That's the core argument. And it brings the Derg straight into this picture. Shabate says explicitly that the Derg's regime, its policies, its actions, you have to look at them through this lens of ongoing empire building.
Wow, okay. So the Derg isn't seen as a break, but a continuation in this source's narrative.
Exactly. Which immediately raises the central question Shabate seems to be asking throughout this whole first part.
Which is,
Did the Derg coming to power actually bring about fundamental change? Did it achieve what the struggles against the old system were fighting for?
that's the key question. And does Shabate offer any way to think about that kind of change?
It does, actually. It uses this quite striking analogy to talk about the difference between just swapping one regime for another versus, a real transformation of the system's essence.
An analogy, what is it?
It uses the image of a snake. Shabate says a snake doesn't stop being a snake just because it molts, just because it sheds its skin.
The snake shedding its skin.
Yeah. Huh. That's vivid.
Yeah, it suggests that, the outward look, new names, maybe some superficial changes, they might hide the fact that the underlying nature of the power structure is still the same.
So Shabate is warning you, the listener, don't be fooled by appearances.
That's a core analytical principle for Shabate. You have to look past the surface, past the slogans, past the stated goals, to understand the true nature, the essence, as it calls it.
Okay, that's a really important framework to keep in mind as we go. So let's apply that. How does Shabate characterize the Haile Selassie regime, the one that came before the Derg? What's the picture it paints?
Well, Shabate's description is, let's say, unequivocal and pretty harsh. It labels the regime flat out as backward and autocratic.
Backward and autocratic. Okay, so fundamentally undemocratic, oppressive in its basic structure according to the source. Yeah, and this autocratic nature, in Shabate's view, wasn't just an internal thing. It immediately links the regime's power, its ability to stay in power, to that external backing we mentioned.
The world colonialist forces.
Exactly. Shabate claims it was supported by them. So in this narrative, the internal oppression was kind of enabled, propped up by these international interests that Shabate calls colonialist.
That connection seems really important to Shabate's whole argument.
It's key. And then Shabate details the results, the consequences of this regime's nature. It says the regime trampled on the fundamental human and democratic rights of the people.
Trampled rights. That's a broad claim. Suppression of basic freedoms, political participation.
Yes, but Shabet gets more specific, which is interesting. It emphasizes the trampling applied particularly to the national rights of the people of Ethiopia.
National rights. So rights related to the different ethnic or national groups within the country.
Precisely. Shabet really highlights this aspect, the status and rights of different nationalities under Haile Selassie's rule.
And does the source suggest why these national rights were particularly trampled? Is there a motive given?
Yes, Shabet offers its interpretation of the motive. It claims the regime's objective was to ensure the dominance of one nationality, the Amhara.
Okay, so Shabet presents the regime not just as generally autocratic, but as actively pursuing the dominance of one specific group over others.
That's the claim. And beyond this internal control and alleged ethnic dominance, Shabet also attributes ambitions outside Ethiopia's borders to the Haile Selassie regime.
Oh, like what?
It claims the regime strove to colonialize the people of Horn of Africa and especially Eritrea in order to realize its expansionist dream.
Wow, colonialize, especially Eritrea. Shabet is very explicit there. It's defining that relationship as attempted colonization, part of a wider goal.
It directly ties into Shabet's initial framing, doesn't it? That the struggle was anti-colonial. The previous regime is painted here as an active colonizing force itself.
And it wasn't just about political control or national rights, was it? Didn't the source mention economics too?
It did. Shabet talks about wealth appropriation. It states the regime appropriated the wealth, and in the first place, the land of the Ethiopian people turning into the private property of the imperial family and the feudal aristocracy.
So taking the country's resources, especially land, and concentrating it in the hands of, well, the elite, the emperor's family, and the aristocracy.
Yeah, adding that economic layer to the critique, it's portrayed as a system enriching the few at the top.
And the overall result of all this, the autocracy, the external support Shabet alleges, the trampling of rights, especially national rights, the push for ethnic dominance, the expansionism, the economic exploitation. What was the outcome for the people, according to Shabet?
The source sums it up starkly. Causing misery. That's presented as the direct human cost of this regime's nature and policies in Shabet's narrative.
Misery. Okay, so given this whole picture backward, autocratic, oppressive, colonialist ambitions causing misery, what does Shabet conclude about the struggle against this regime?
Well, given all that, Shabet concludes it was simply natural that the struggles of the Eritrean people and the peoples of Ethiopia should overthrow the regime of Haile Selassie.
Natural. So the source frames the revolution or the struggle not just as justified, but as almost inevitable given the conditions it describes.
Exactly, an inevitable response. But having set that up, Shabet immediately pivots. It asks that crucial question we mentioned earlier.
But did the fall of Haile Selassie achieve the objectives of the struggle?
Precisely. And this is where Shabet brings the Dergue onto the stage and starts analyzing whether anything fundamentally changed or if it was just, the snake shedding its skin.
Right. So what is Shabet's initial framing of the Dergue? Right off the bat.
The primary framing is that the Dergue had attempted to strengthen the efforts at empire building which it inherited from Haile Selassie.
Strengthen the empire building efforts. That's a huge claim. So again, inheriting and continuing the old project, not breaking from it, in Shabet's view.
That's the fundamental interpretation offered by this source. And Shabet then looks at the Dergue's first moves and questions their motives. It notes the Dergue initially condemned the misery people were suffering under Haile Selassie.
Which sounds like they were on the people's side, maybe.
Well, Shabet is immediately critical of that. It frames it as purely tactical. It says this condemnation wasn't because the Dergue genuinely upheld the legitimate causes of the people.
But why then?
But because, according to Shabet, the Dergue was not in a position to confront them head-on as it had not yet consolidated its power.
Ah, so the source sees it as weakness, using popular language because they weren't strong enough yet to ignore those grievances.
Exactly. A strategic move by a new power finding its feet, not real solidarity, in Shabet's analysis. And the source mentions the first slogan the Dergue used.
What was it?
Ethiopia Tikdem.
Ethiopia first.
Ethiopia first. And what's Shabet's take on that slogan?
Dismissive. Calls it meaningless. And it connects this slogan to an early Dergue attempt to set up a kind of hybrid constitutional monarchy. A monarchy? I thought they overthrew the emperor.
Well, this initial idea, according to Shabet, involved some kind of hybrid system, but it says this move was thwarted by a broad popular opposition.
So the people push back against that early idea.
That's what Shabbat suggests, that this early attempt and the Ethiopia Tikdem slogan just didn't cut it. People wanted more fundamental change.
Okay, so facing that opposition, what did the Derg do next, according to Shabbat?
Towards the end of 1974, Shabbat says, the Derg shifted its public messaging and brought out a second slogan, Ethiopian Socialism.
Ethiopian Socialism. That sounds much more radical.
It does, but Shabbat's view is just as critical. It calls the slogan equally senseless.
Equally senseless. Why? Doesn't Shabbat see this as a genuine ideological shift?
No, Shabbat attributes the adoption of socialist language not to real belief, but to the Derg feeling that this would echo the demands of the people. Again, portrayed as a calculated move to sound like they were aligned with popular demands, purely to consolidate power.
Just trying to co-opt the language of the movement.
That's the interpretation. And Shabbat provides some context for why the Derg might have felt pressured to do this.
What context?
It notes that the politicalized student body was challenging the regime and agitating against its empty and deceptive slogans.
Ah, okay. So students were actively criticizing the Derg's early rhetoric, calling it empty.
Yes. Shabbat suggests this active challenge, particularly from students, pushed the regime towards using more radical-sounding language like Ethiopian socialism to try and, regain control of the narrative or seem like they were meeting those demands.
Interesting dynamic. The regime trying to consolidate, using slogans, but facing challenges from groups like students.
It's central to how Shabbat portrays this early period, a constant maneuvering for power.
So, building on this period where they adopted Ethiopian socialism, what else did the Derg do, according to Shabbat? It mentioned something called the Zamecha program.
Yes, the Zamecha. Shabbat says it was introduced around the same time, concurrently with the Ethiopian Socialism Proclamation, and it was presented in the guise of development.
In the guise of development, what did it actually involve?
According to Shabbat, it was a pretty significant action. The regime basically dispersed throughout the country all university and high school students and their teachers.
Disperse them, send them out from the cities.
Yeah, a massive deployment of educated youth and their instructors out into the rural areas.
And Shabbat sees this not as a real development effort, but
as serving the Derga's own objectives, likely, linked to controlling or maybe neutralizing that same student opposition it just mentioned, getting them out of the cities.
Okay. But did it work, according to Shabbat? Did it achieve the Derg's goals?
Shabbat says no. It states the program failed to achieve the Derg's objectives.
It fared. How so?
Interestingly, Shabbat argues it actually backfired. It had the opposite effect.
Opposite.
Yeah. Shabbat states, on the contrary, it facilitated the spreading of the opposition and strengthened the channelings of the regime.
Wait, so sending critical students out actually helped spread opposition ideas across the country?
That's the analysis from Shabbat. The Dergu inadvertently created networks of resistance by dispersing these potentially critical individuals, a classic unintended consequence in this view.
Fascinating. Okay, so alongside Zamecha, what other early moves did the Derg make to consolidate power, according to Shabbat?
Shabbat points to some major economic measures, specifically nationalization proclamations in 1975.
Nationalizations of what?
Two big ones mentioned. March 1975, a proclamation to nationalize rural lands. And then July 1975, they proclaimed the expropriation of all urban lands and buildings.
Wow, those are huge changes. Taking over rural land, urban land, buildings. Shabbat presents these as part of the power grab.
As part of the consolidation effort, yes. And Shabbat notes something else happening at the same time as these nationalizations.
What's that?
It says the Derga initiated the establishment of urban and rural kabelas.
Kabelas, what were these, according to Shabbat? Community councils.
Shabbat is very specific about the purpose it attributes to them. It says unequivocally they were created to better control the popular opposition.
Control. Not grassroots democracy, then.
Not in Shabbat's view. They're presented as state tools, designed for surveillance and suppression right down at the local level.
Okay. So Zamecha, which backfired, nationalizations, creating kabelas for control. These were the early tools Shabbat sees the Dergi using.
That's the picture Shabbat paints of that early phase, yes. Tools to solidify power and manage dissent.
But things didn't stay at that level, did they? Did Shabbat describe an escalation?
Oh, yes. A dramatic escalation. Shabbat mentions the Derg issuing National Democratic Revolution documents in April 1976. Sounds programmatic, maybe even progressive on paper.
Oh.
But Shabbat quickly links this period to a major shift towards, outright terror.
Terror. When did this shift happen, according to the source?
Shabate pinpoints it. Towards the end of 1976 October. That's when things really changed in this account.
And how did this terror manifest?
It explicitly connects back to those kibbules we just talked about. Shabate states the regime convert the kibbules into organs of red terror.
Converted them. The structures meant for control became tools for terror.
Exactly. A clear shift in Shabate's narrative. From surveillance and dispersal to active state-sponsored violence carried out through these local structures.
That's a chilling transformation described by the source.
It is, and Shabate draws a sharp contrast between this brutal reality and the Dergue's earlier self-presentation. It notes, very pointedly,
What?
by then, what the Dergue touted as a bloodless revolution had turned to be bloody and terroristic.
So Shabate highlights the hypocrisy, the gap between the bloodless revolution claim and the reality of the Red Terror.
A very sharp critique from the source, yes,
Yeah.
exposing that perceived gap.
And who was targeted by this Red Terror, according to Shabate?
Shabate says it became the defining feature of the Dergue's strategy for dealing with internal opposition, particularly targeting students and the intellectuals, the very groups who had been critical earlier.
And how did they go about targeting them? Was it just random violence?
Shabate describes it as more systematic. It says the Dergue adopted the tactic of isolation and gradual liquidation against these groups.
Isolation and gradual liquidation. Why that approach, according to Shabate? Why not just open crackdowns?
Shabate suggests a tactical reason. Open confrontation would have created difficulties for it. So in this view, the Dergue avoided massive public purges initially, preferring a more targeted step-by-step dismantling of opposition networks and individuals. Less risky, perhaps.
Okay, so a calculated gradual elimination. Does Shabate name specific groups targeted?
Yes, it focuses on how the Dergue implemented the strategy against specific groups, identifying the EPRP, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Party, as the strongest of these opposition groups at that time.
The EPRP. And how did the Dergue target them, according to Shabate?
Shabate claims the Dergue exploited the contradictions among the various groups claiming to be Marxist and won some of them to its side.
So playing different leftist groups against each other, aggravating existing divisions to isolate the main perceived threat, the EPRP.
That's the strategy Shabate describes, and it names the tools used in this liquidation process.
Tools.
It points to the so-called Provisional Office for Mass Organizations and, crucially, those Red Terror kibbules, and it adds a detail. It says Myson was heavily represented in those kibbules carrying out the terror.
Myson, another group.
Yes, another one of the Marxist-oriented groups. Shabate highlights their role within the kibbules in helping the Dergue liquidate the EPRP. It points to specific state or state-aligned bodies and alliances as the instruments of suppression.
So using one group to help eliminate another, and what happened after the EPRP was dealt with, according to Shabate?
Shabate describes it as methodical. Once it had finished with the EPRP, it turned against the rest and devoured them one by one.
Devoured them. Strong language from the source. A systematic destruction of any rivals.
That's the portrayal. And Shabate makes a point about the fate of Myson, the group that had apparently helped liquidate the EPRP.
What happened to Myson?
Shabate notes that Myson was actually a major partner in the Dergue's coalition early on, but they became the next victim.
The Dergue turned on its own allies.
That's what Shabate claims. It underscores the argument that the Dergue prioritized its own power above all else, discarding allies when they were no longer needed or maybe became a potential threat themselves. All according to this source's interpretation, of course.
This whole process sounds like a brutal consolidation of power. Shabate calls this a second round of dealing with opposition.
Yes. After the main threats like EPRP and Myson were decimated, another strong word Shabate uses, it says the rest were dissolved through terror and opportunism. Less direct confrontation perhaps, but still elimination.
And Shabate gives an example of this dissolving.
It mentions an organization called the Union of Ethiopian Marxist-Leninist Organization, saying it was simply discarded by the regime.
Discarded. And replaced by what?
According to Shabate, its place was taken by a new grouping of so-called true communist individuals.
So-called true communists. What does Shabate imply there?
The phrasing suggests Shabate sees this not as a real ideological shift, but more like the regime ditching formal, potentially independent organizations in favor of a hand-picked network of loyal individuals just given a new label. Easier to control, perhaps.
Okay. So while all this elimination and co-option is happening, was the Dergue building its own structures?
Yes. Shabate says that concurrently, the Dergue was working to formalize its own political party. It formed a commission to organize a workers' party.
A workers' party. What was the purpose of this, according to Shabate? Genuine representation.
Shabate explicitly links the party's formation to the Dergue's goal to consolidate its power.
So, not about broader politics, but another tool for the ruling military group to cement its control.
That's the narrative Shabate presents. This commission eventually established the Ethiopian Workers' Party, but the source frames it as fundamentally about locking down the Dergue's authority.
Right. So, Shabate lays out this whole sequence.
Yeah.
The emergence, the slogans, Zemecha, the Kibbalese turning into terror organs, liquidating opposition group by group, forming its own party. What's the big takeaway Shabate draws from all this?
Shabate presents this whole sequence as demonstrating, quote, in a dramatic and concise way, the manner in which the Dergue emerged and the tactics it utilized to consolidate its power. It sees this history as revealing the regime's true methods.
And having laid all that out, what's the overall conclusion Shabate comes to? Does it connect back to that initial premise about empire building?
It does, explicitly. Shabate argues that all these events add up to a complete picture which proves that the Dergue and its regime, its policies and actions, were continuation of the Ethiopian empire-building mission in which the Haile Selassie and his predecessors had failed.
Wow. That's the core argument coming through loud and clear. Despite all the changes, the essence, the empire-building drive remained the same, according to Shabate.
A very strong assertion. Shabate argues that regardless of the revolutionary talk, the socialist labels, the fundamental drive was inherited from the old regime, and it dismisses all that ideological language as just superficial.
How does it put that?
It says things like Marxism, socialism, progress, reforms, and cosmetic changes and details did not confuse anyone. The implication is anyone paying attention could see through it.
So back to the snake analogy again.
Exactly. Shabate hammers that point home. One could not understand the essence of a thing merely from its form and external appearance. The socialist language, the party that's just the form, the external appearance, not the real essence, in Shabate's view.
So Shabate insists you have to look deeper.
Yes. It stresses it was important to examine the essence of the regime and view the process of its emergence from the perspective of the fundamental political problems and their resolution.
Okay, the fundamental political problems. What does Shabate identify as those core unresolved issues? What were the benchmarks it uses to judge the Dergue?
According to Shabate, the key problems, the basic demands of the people's struggles, centered on democracy, and critically within that, the question of nationalities.
Democracy and the question of nationality.
Yes. Shabate looks at the struggle of the peoples of Ethiopia and their basic demands, and asserts pretty clearly that the institution of a democratic system was a precondition for economic, social, and cultural changes. Democracy had to come first.
And within democracy, the top issue was nationalities.
That's what Shabate calls the foremost question of democracy, the question of nationalities. It wasn't secondary in this source's view. It was the absolute central critical piece of the democratic puzzle.
And does Shabate specify what addressing this nationalities question actually required? What would a solution look like, according to the source?
It's quite specific. It outlines several requirements that Shabate says were necessary.
Like what?
Things like recognition of the right of nationalities to self-determination, also acknowledgement of their right to administer themselves, and the setting up of autonomous administrative systems.
Self-determination, self-administration, autonomy, those are significant demands for the rights of different national groups.
Very significant. Shabate says solving this also meant working towards a democratic order based on free union and equality, an order that would really serve their interest and foster their progress.
And this democratic order had to include basic rights, too.
Yes. Shabate adds it had also to guarantee and incorporate the fundamental human and democratic rights. It lays out this whole complex set of requirements for dealing with nationalities and democracy, but then characterizes the issue itself as
what?
As simple and straightforward.
Simple and straightforward, after listing all those complex requirements.
Seems contradictory, but that's the term Shabate uses, perhaps meaning the principle was clear, even if the implementation was complex.
Okay. So Shabate sets up this clear test for the Dergue. Did it address this supposedly simple and straightforward fundamental question of nationalities and democracy, the core demand, as Shabate sees it?
And Shabate asks that question directly, but had the Dergue seriously addressed it?
And the answer, according to Shabate,
an emphatic, absolute no. A flat rejection.
why not? Does Shobait explain why the Derg failed this fundamental test, in its view?
Yes, it gives specific reasons, arguing they stem directly from the regime's inherent nature, that essence again.
What's the first reason?
Reason 1. Granting fundamental rights conflicts with its ambition of building a dictatorial empire.
Ah, so respecting rights, especially national rights, was fundamentally incompatible with the Derg's goal of centralized dictatorial power, according to Shobait.
Exactly. Shebate argues that recognizing these rights wasn't seen by the Dergs as a solution, but as an existential threat to the regime.
A threat. And the second reason Shobait gives.
It's even more blunt. A democratic solution to the issue would mean the end of its existence.
The end of its existence. That's a powerful claim. Shobait is suggesting that allowing real democracy or autonomy for nationalities would have just completely undermined the Derg's power structure, leading to its collapse.
That's the stark argument Shebate makes. The regime couldn't afford democracy, essentially.
So, given this perceived conflict, the D's ambitions versus the people's demands, what did the Derg do about the nationalities question, according to Shobait?
Predictably, in Shebate's view, it attempted to crush the democratic movements and demands of the Ethiopian nationalities, as well as other opposition movements, by force.
Force. That was the only answer.
According to Shebate, yes. Force was the Der's response to these fundamental political issues, including the nationalities question, suppression, not accommodation.
And what was the result of this forceful approach in Shobait's analysis? Did it work? Did it crush the movements?
Shebate points to the outcome as proof of the regime's failure, what it calls its bankrupt nature. It states that actually, contrary to its desires and as a consequence of its fascist acts, this attempt to crush resistance by force completely backfired.
Backfired how?
The resistance of the nationalities and of other opposition forces was growing.
So instead of stamping out opposition, the violence actually fueled it, made it stronger.
That's Shebate's argument. The regime's actions generated more resistance, not less. And this outcome, the source concludes, is a direct manifestation of the bankrupt nature of the Derg. It showed the regime's core approach was fundamentally flawed and unsustainable.
Okay. So, having laid out this failure to address the broader nationalities question, does Shobait then zoom in on Eritrea specifically?
It does. It transitions directly to that, posing the question, what about the regime's handling of the just and legitimate cause of the Eritrean people?
And how does Shobait frame the Derg in this specific context?
It immediately uses that term again, the colonialist Derg. And it explicitly links the Derg to Haile Selassie on this point.
How so?
Shebate says the Derg, just like the Haile Selassie regime, did not fail to recognize that the main threat to its expansionist and imperial ambition came from Eritrea.
So Eritrea is seen by Shobait as the #1 obstacle to the regime's core imperial project.
That's how Shebate portrays the Derg's thinking. And it adds that the Derg realized from the start that it would not crush the Eritrean people's struggle with the weakened state apparatus of Haile Selassie.
Meaning they knew they needed more power, a different approach than the old regime had at the time of his fall.
Seems so. They understood the challenge Eritrea posed required something more.
So what was the Derg's initial approach to Eritrea? According to Shobait, did they immediately resort to force?
Shebate describes an initial phase involving an alleged readiness for peace.
Alleged readiness. So Shobait is skeptical from the start.
Very skeptical. It notes that the Eritrean issue was a burning issue and that a peaceful solution was demanded by both Eritreans and Ethiopians, creating public pressure.
So there was pressure for peace.
Yes. And given that pressure, Shebate claims, the Derg, as in all other question, hypocritically declared its readiness to solve the problem.
Hypocritically. So Shobait sees this peace declaration as insincere from day one, just a public relations move.
That's exactly how Shebate frames it. Pure hypocrisy. And it claims to have evidence for this alleged deception.
Evidence. What evidence does Shobait cite?
It refers to a classified 1975 document that's mentioned in the source material.
A classified document from 1975. What did it supposedly reveal?
According to Shebate's account of this document, it revealed the Derg's real strategy. The cornerstone of its policy was to engage in peace maneuvers until such time as it consolidates its power.
Ah, so Shobait uses this document reference to argue the peace talk was just a tactic, a way to buy time while they built up their military strength.
Precisely. That's the claim Shebate makes based on this document reference. Engage in peace talk publicly, prepare for war privately.
And did Shebate connect this to the Derg's foreign policy too?
Yes, it links it back to that same classified document reference. Shebate explains the Derg realized that if the Eritrean case, which Shebate describes as having solid legal grounds, got international attention, Ethiopia was bound to lose.
So they were worried about the legal arguments internationally.
That's Shebate's interpretation. This perceived legal vulnerability drove their main foreign policy goal regarding Eritrea, which Shebate says was isolating the Eritrean people's case in the international as well as regional levels. Keep it off the world stage.
Okay, so how did they try to achieve this isolation and carry out the deceptive peace maneuvers, according to Shebate?
Shebate says the Derg set up peace delegations and committees and met with the EPLF and ELF, the main Eritrean liberation fronts.
They actually met with them.
Yes, but Shebate portrays these meetings as just part of the deception, an attempt at misleading the Eritrean people and the world.
Just for show. What was the impact of these talks, according to Shebate? Did they fool anyone?
Shebate makes an interesting distinction here. It says, although this initiative raised the hopes of the Eritrean people who have always struggled for peace and their organizations, it did not in any way deceive them.
So the general population might have hoped for peace, but the leadership, the EPLF and ELF, weren't taken in by the Derg's moves, in Shebate's view.
That's the suggestion. The organizations saw through the alleged tactics.
And while these supposed peace talks were happening, what else was the Derg doing on the ground in Eritrea, according to Shebate?
This is where Shebate emphasizes the dual nature of the Derg's approach. It states starkly that, parallel with its feigned peace pronouncements, the Derg was conducting an extensive and brutal campaign of terror.
Terror. At the same time as peace talks.
Exactly. Public peace rhetoric, private violence, that's the picture Shebate paints.
What kind of terror does Shebate describe?
It says this terror campaign happened in the cities and rural areas and involved things like summary executions of innocent civilians by shooting and strangulation and the burning of villages.
Shooting, strangulation, burning villages. Shebate provides some grim details to illustrate the brutality directed at civilians.
Yes, these examples as presented by Shebate are meant to show the reality behind the peace facade.
And how did the Eritrean side respond to this situation? Peace talks combined with terror, according to Shebate.
Shebate claims that even in this brutal context, the Eritrean revolution demonstrated its readiness to enter into dialogue for peace. It contrasts the revolution's supposed genuine desire for peace with the Derg's alleged deception.
Did they make specific efforts towards talks?
Shebate mentions the EPLF specifically, saying it sought to find out the Derg's views on peace so it could also present its proposals and create the conditions for face-to-face talks. This suggests active attempts, in Shebate's account, to get real negotiations going.
But did the Derg reciprocate these efforts, according to Shebate?
Shebate reiterates its core assessment. The Derg, however, was not prepared for genuine talks, aiming at a real solution based on things like self-determination. That was never the goal, the source implies.
So what happened when the Derg couldn't maintain the facade anymore? When the Eritrean challenge grew too strong?
According to Shebate, when the challenge became so strong it denied the Derg room for maneuver with its tactics, the regime dropped the pretense and resorted to its planned military solution. It launched its Red March offensive.
The Red March. A major military campaign. And what was the outcome, according to Shebate?
Shebate states that this large-scale campaign failed.
It failed. And after that military failure, did the Derg change its approach?
Shebate says after the Red March failed, the Derg proclaimed its 9-point policy. But this policy was rejected by the Eritrean organization.
Rejected. So even after a military setback, the political proposal still wasn't acceptable, presumably because it didn't meet the core demands as Shebate sees them.
That seems to be the implication in Shebate's narrative. So the source's overall assessment remains consistent. The Derg's aim regarding Eritrea was always to engage in hypocritical peace initiatives for public consumption while simultaneously carrying out military preparations to crush the Eritrean revolution.
Calculated deceit, always aimed at military victory.
Okay, so after the Red March failed and the 9-point policy was rejected, what was the Derg's next move, according to Shebate? Did they prepare for even bigger military action? Yes. And Shebate explains how, in its analysis, the Derg manufactured reasons, pretext, for launching war on an even larger scale.
Pretexts. Like what?
It claims the regime fabricated a bogus foreign threat,
A fake foreign threat. Why would they do that, according to Shabait?
Shabait suggests multiple purposes. First, to induce the Ethiopian people to take up arms to fight in a war they didn't even understood. Frame it as national defense, not an internal political conflict.
Get popular buy-in for the war effort.
Exactly. And second, to divert the Ethiopian people's attention from its internal opposition. Create an external enemy to distract from problems at home.
A classic diversion tactic, in Shabait's view. Was there anything happening at the time that made this easier?
Shabait notes that the sharpening of the Ethio-Somali conflict at that time facilitated this deception. The real conflict with Somalia provided a convenient backdrop for the Dergue to amplify a broader foreign threat narrative, according to the source.
Okay, so they create the pretext. But large-scale war needs weapons. How did they get them, according to Shabait?
Shabait states this problem was solved through Soviet intervention and largesse.
Soviet intervention. So Shabait highlights external military support, specifically from the Soviet Union, as crucial for enabling the Dergue's big offensive.
Absolutely crucial in Shabait's account. And with this major backing, Shabait claims, the Dergue was therefore highly confident that it would crash the Eritrean Revolution. They believed the Soviet arms gave them the edge they needed.
So, confident of victory, did they just launch the attack? Or were there more peace maneuvers?
Shabait mentions one last round of talks just before the big offensive, what it calls brief, farcical peace talks held in Berlin.
Farcical talks. Who organized them?
Shabait attributes them directly to Soviet initiative and East German orchestration.
So, orchestrated by the Dergue's main backer. And what was the purpose of these talks, according to Shabait? A genuine last chance for peace.
Not according to Shabait. Its stated purpose is highly critical, to prepare the grounds that would serve as a pretext for the military offensive.
A pretext again. So the talks were designed to fail, just to give the Dergue justification to attack.
That's exactly how Shabait presents it, a staged diplomatic event.
And did it play out as Shabait suggests?
Yes. Shabait states that what triggered the offensive was precisely this. When the talks demonstrated that the EPLF would not succumb to pressure and intimidation or betray its cause, the Dergue initiated its large-scale offensive. The EPLF holding firm provided the excuse the Dergue needed in Shabait's narrative.
Okay, so the big offensive is launched. How does Shabait describe the outcome of this massive Soviet-backed effort?
Shabait brings this part of its narrative towards a close by stating the result. After almost 10 years of heavy destruction and bloodshed, it became clear that the regime's goals and plans have failed.
10 years, and it failed. The Dergue didn't crush the Eritrean Revolution, even with all that support?
That's Shabait's conclusion. The protracted, bloody conflict did not achieve the Dergue's objective.
And Shabait uses this failure as more evidence for his main argument about Dergue's nature.
Yes, it reiterates that this whole experience with Eritrea was one among many other things which exposed the nature of the Dergue, another proof point in its view.
Shabait then seems to circle back, summarizing the Dergue's overall impact on the rights of the Ethiopian people more broadly.
It does. It lists again the rights it claims were consistently trampled. Fundamental rights, those of speech, movement, and organization, basic freedoms denied.
And how was popular power denied, in Shabait's analysis?
By prohibiting the formation of democratic institutions, no real avenues for people to exercise power.
Instead of democratic institutions, what did the Dergue promote, according to Shabait?
It claims the regime worked to strengthen a workers' party based on the army and the dictatorial police authority or the Kibbalese.
So, reinforcing that view of the party, not based on the people, but on the coercive state apparatus, the army, police, and those Red Terror Kibbalese.
Exactly. That's the foundation of power, Shabait describes.
And what was the consequence of all this suppressing rights, denying democracy, relying on force, according to Shabait?
The direct consequence, Shabait states, was that opposition to the regime and desertion from it had been growing. The regime's own methods were breeding more resistance and disaffection.
Did Shabait suggest the regime itself was aware of this growing opposition or instability?
It goes further. Shabait discusses the regime's internal fears. It claims the Dergue didn't even trust its main repressive machinery, the military institution, and was afraid the army might conduct mutiny or carry out a coup.
Wow, afraid of its own army. That paints a picture of deep paranoia and insecurity at the top.
A regime fundamentally distrustful even of the forces meant to uphold it.
And did the Dergue have a way of dealing with this fear of its own military, according to Shabait?
Shabait claims it did. a specific countertactic. It says the regime emasculated the army's role by miring it in continuous positional warfare in Eritrea and brutally crushing any signs of opposition within the army itself.
Wait, emasculated the army by keeping it fighting in Eritrea.
That's the significant claim Shabbat makes, that the endless war in Eritrea wasn't just about defeating the revolution, but also served the Dergue's internal purpose of keeping the potentially threatening military bogged down, preoccupied, and under tight control, prevent it from turning on the regime.
That's a very cynical interpretation of the protracted war presented by the source.
It is. It adds another layer to Shabait's critique of the Dergue's motives and methods.
How does Shabait wrap up this whole section of its analysis? Does it talk about later changes?
It briefly mentions what it calls a much-rehearsed scenario, involving steps taken towards proclaiming a republic. This seems to refer to later formal changes in how the state was structured.
A republic? That sounds like a significant change.
But Shabait is completely dismissive. It states this scenario did not hold anything new.
Nothing new, why not? Becoming a republic seems different from a military junta.
Shabait explains its reasoning, sticking to its core benchmarks. It says these changes did not lead to the exercise of the right of nationalities and the establishment of broad popular democracy in Ethiopia, or a political solution to the Eritrean issue.
So because it didn't solve those fundamental problems, nationalities, democracy, Eritrea, any formal change like becoming a republic was just superficial, just changing the label, not the essence.
Exactly. In Shabait's view, it failed the crucial tests. Therefore, it wasn't real change.
And this leads to Shabait's final concluding statement for this part of the analysis.
Yes. Tying everything together, the view of Haile Selassie, the Dergue's emergence, its tactics, its failures on core issues, its approach to Eritrea, Shabait concludes definitively. All these clearly show that there was nothing in the nature of the regime to differentiate it from that of Haile Selassie.
Nothing to differentiate it. That's the final word from Shabait in this section. Despite everything, the revolution, the socialist rhetoric, the different structures, the years of war, the fundamental essence of the Dergue, in Shabait's specific narrative, was indistinguishable from the old imperial regime it replaced.
A powerful, unambiguous conclusion from this source. It hammers home that empire-building ambition, suppression of rights, denial of democracy, failure on the nationalities question, and a deceptive, forceful approach to Eritrea remain the defining characteristics, according to Shabait.
Okay, so let's just quickly recap the key points from this first part of our deep dive, drawing strictly from the Shabait source material we've unpacked today.
Please do.
Shabait paints Haile Selassie's regime as backward, autocratic, propped up by external forces, trampling rights, especially national rights, aiming for Amhara dominance, pursuing expansionism, especially towards Eritrea, and causing widespread misery.
Making the struggle against it seem natural in the source's view.
Right. But Shabait argues the Dergue's rise wasn't a real break, but a continuation of that same empire-building ambition. It used deceptive tactics, meaningless slogans like Ethiopia Tikdem, and later Ethiopian Socialism.
Which Shabait frames as purely strategic, not genuine.
It tried to consolidate control through things like the Zemetra program, which Shabait says backfired and spread opposition, and the Kibbalese, local structures, initially for control.
Which were then transformed into organs of red terror.
Exactly. Shabait describes a systematic liquidation of internal opposition, starting with the EPRP, then even turning on allies like Mason. It argues the Dergue totally failed to address the core questions of nationalities and democracy because doing so fundamentally conflicted with its dictatorial goals and threatened its very existence.
And its approach to Eritrea, according to Shabait, was marked by deep hypocrisy, fake peace talks and committees, alongside brutal terror campaigns, all designed to buy time for military preparations.
Preparations facilitated by Soviet support, leading to huge offensives that ultimately failed, according to the source, after immense bloodshed. All of which, Shabait argues, just exposes the Dergue's true nature.
As being fundamentally no different in its essence from the Haile Selassie regime it overthrew, that's the core Shabait narrative we've explored today.
And again, super important to stress. Everything we've discussed is solely from this source, Shabait. We're exploring its specific interpretation.
Absolutely. And remember, this was only part 1 of 4. We've laid the foundation by looking at Shabait's view of Haile Selassie and its initial, very critical take on the Dergue.
There's a lot more material in Shabait's narrative to get into in the next parts.
Definitely. But as you think about what we've covered today, maybe reflect on that central idea from Shabait. discerning the true essence of a regime or a movement, looking beyond the labels and the surface
The
changes.
snake molting its skin.
Right. How does Shabate's approach focusing on actions like suppression, terror, how fundamental rights or national questions are handled, the nature of peace efforts rather than just the slogans, a socialism republic, or structures, parties, committees, how does that provide a framework maybe for you to think critically about other political narratives or regimes you encounter?
Is the core nature really changing, or is it just a new skin? That's the question Shabate forces us to ask, based on its analysis.
A provocative thought drawn directly from the source's perspective.
Indeed. We hope you'll join us as we continue this deep dive into the Shabate source material in Part 2. Until then.